This LOS is describe the business cycle and its phases. Overview of the business cycle. A business cycle consists of an expansionary period and a contractionary period. Characteristics of a business cycle. 1. They are typical in economies that rely on business enterprises. 2. There are alternating phases of expansion and contraction. 3. Phases occur throughout the economy, most often simultaneously. And finally, 4. Phases reoccur but vary in duration and intensity. An expansion occurs after a low point, the trough, and a contraction occurs after the highest point, the peak. A contraction is also referred to as a recession and is referred to as a depression if severe and if aggregate activity declines. So this is just a graph that most people should be familiar with. On the y-axis, you've got the level of national economic activity, and on the x-axis, you've got time. Okay, so over time, the economy goes through different cycles. So you can see peak, contraction after a peak, hitting the trough, expansion, and then peak. I've seen practice questions as easy as, what phase of the business cycle comes before or after another phase. And so you just have to remember it's peak to contraction to trough to expansion and then back to peak. I've seen different textbooks using different words for contraction and expansion, for example. You just need to make sure that it's memorized exactly as per the CFA. So peak, contraction, trough, expansion, peak. And then, of course, you can draw a trend line. Continuing with the overview of the business cycle, we're just going to run through a typical scenario here, recession. So you can see it starts with aggregate demand declines. Inventories begin to accumulate, companies slow production, companies cut non-essential expenditures, and it leads to a lower GDP. So I just want to remind you, we've seen this before in a previous LOS, that a short-run recessionary gap exists when the economy is in a recession and equilibrium output is less than potential GDP. So recall from that graph, it started with a shift in the aggregate demand curve to the left. And you can see here, aggregate demand declines. So I like to tie together two different readings, two different LOS into one, and that helps you start to consolidate the understanding. So you can see the aggregate demand shifted to the left. There's no change in, no shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve. So what happens here, you can see prices have declined and income and output has declined, and so that the equilibrium is less than the potential GDP. So a quick practice question. Business cycle analysis most commonly describes economic activity that is conducted through A, state enterprises, B, agricultural co-ops, or C, private corporations. Well, I think you'd be happy to see that question on an exam. C is correct. Business cycles relate to fluctuations in national economic activity generated mainly through business enterprises. We're studying business cycles, and it's talking about private corporations. One last practice question to finish this LOS. The characteristic business cycle patterns of trough, expansion, peak, and contraction are A, periodic, B, recurrent, or C, of similar duration. Okay, as I've often said, the CFA test, a lot of it is English test, in this case subject economics, or it's English test, subject quant, English test, subject accounting. Not always doing calculations, so it's very, you need to be very careful with the language and pay a lot of close detail to the language, because in this case, A, periodic seems almost right. Business cycle patterns happen periodically. We periodically have a recession, or we periodically have an expansion. But no, the correct word here is recurrent, okay? They recur, but vary in duration and intensity. So the characteristic business cycle patterns of trough, expansion, peak, and contraction are recurrent. So I copied from the previous slide, characteristics of the business cycle, typical in economies that rely on business enterprises. Okay, and that was, the language was changed in the previous question to private companies. So again, sometimes it's not the exact word, but the meaning is there, and that's what you need to be careful with. Alternating phases of expansion and contraction. Phases occur throughout the economy, most often simultaneously, And then I put here in bold green, phases reoccur, but vary in duration and intensity. So you can see that word recurrent, that means reoccur. And that's, just a little tip there on terms of the language. The language is so important because sometimes a lot of the questions, A and B, both seem right, but one is more right, and it has to do with having the exact language as per the CFA text, okay? And that's the last slide for this LOS. Thank you.